I thought maybe we could just have a plain talk about the day after. The day after your retirement. To do so, I think we must go back a few years. We should go back to the day you started to work for this great organization. I'm sure you remember that day. Several days after. You will remember coming home in the evening of those first few days, feeling you were not suited for the job. You felt you should give up. Someone seemed to take an interest in you, spent some time showing you how to do the job better and easier. And as the years rolled on, you found yourself taking on this role of teacher. Down through your 20, 30, 40, and in some cases 50 years, you were helping someone, showing how to do the job better and easier. There are so many today who remember you as a friend, took an interest in the work. What a pleasure for you over these years. You were so happy some of these young fellows were promoted to more responsible positions. You remember saying that young Bill was a smart fellow. Inwardly you were glad that you had something to do with his background. So life went on until you reached that magic age, the day you retired. And if these employees like you had not faith in the young Bills they taught, your company would not have prospered and gone ahead. Attain that exalted position it now holds, to command the right to that title, the world's most complete transportation system. You are important people. Your image is living in all the young Bills throughout the world, who are also, at this very moment, teaching and perfecting other young Bills who will carry on. These 70 years or so of life are all we've got. But we can fill them, if we will, with great deeds and greater dreams.
George Everett Mayne, or Everett as he was known through his life, was born in 1901 at his family's farm in Potter Settlement, near Tweed, Ontario. The farmhouse he was raised in is shown in this photo, taken in the 1940s. It had been built by his father in 1897, so he could have a separate home from the nearby family log homestead he himself had been raised in. Everett's love of the railways started early in his school years, when he would draw maps of the railway lines in his exercise books. He is shown sitting second from the left in the front row of his village school in 1907. Everett's schooling was interrupted by farm work required for the First World War effort, and he did not finish high school. Age 16 when the war ended, he joined the Canadian Pacific Railway as an assistant agent at their small rural station of Actinolite, then Sulphide. The duties included sweeping the platform and lighting the gas lamps on them. His beginning salary in June 1918 was $45 a month. He was transferred to Agincourt in March 1919 as an assistant agent, but with a big hike in pay to $87.50 a month. However, in this year and early in 1920, he was off on sickness leave for over 3 months, all with no pay. He had caught the dreaded Spanish flu and returned to the family farm to convalesce. Although desperately ill, he pulled through and returned to his job in Agincourt. Everett's early work and much of the subsequent work was in the operating department involved in the station and train yard operations. His work in Agincourt would have included involvement in switching freight cars in the marshalling yard, where arriving freight cars were sorted and put on trains going to their destinations. He was promoted to an operator position in 1920-21. The Canadian Pacific Railway had its own telegraphy network to manage their rail traffic. The railway also offered to send messages for a price to the general public and private businesses. Everett also learned Morse code and worked the telegraph machines as part of his job. It was at his lodging house in Agincourt where Everett met Eva Jane Harris. They married in 1923 when he was a telegrapher with the CPR. Eva's father, William Richard Harris, worked as a section man and later as a pump man for the CPR. 3 of William's 5 daughters married railwaymen, 2 with the CPR and 1 with the CNR. After moving to other stations, Trenton, Cobourg, and Toronto, Everett was transferred to Peterborough in 1924, where his and Eva's children, Jack and Gwyn, were born, and where he continued working as an operator. For the 5 years from 1928 on, Everett was posted to other stations, notably London, where he graduated to ticket clerk at a salary of $100 per month. In 1933, during the Great Depression, he was laid off from the railway, but continued to be available at all times to be called back. Eva worked part-time and Everett worked as a salesman. When they needed a new place to live in Agincourt, the only one they could find was an inn with a soda fountain and ice cream parlor, so they rented that and Eva took over the running of it, inclusive of offering meals, with some help from children Jack and Gwyn. Everett was finally called back to the CPR in December of 1939, the year the Second World War started. The railway played an important role in the war, transporting freight and soldiers. Further promotions and transfers to Belleville, London, and Schrieber ensued for Everett. In 1944, he was a dispatcher in Toronto at a salary of $277.43 per month, before being promoted later that year to be assistant superintendent, Bruce Division, and then going on to similar positions in Sudbury, North Bay, and Schrieber. His work required Everett to be away from the family home in Agincourt, either at his various postings or overnight stays at hotels where his work had to be attended to. In one instance, he overheard that another man was being turned away because there was no vacancies anywhere. So Everett told the man that he could have the other bed in the hotel room he had for that night. The man gratefully accepted. However, Everett was notorious for being a loud snorer, and the man in the other bed could not get a wink of sleep. In 1948, Everett was promoted to the post of Superintendent Montreal Terminals, and he was allocated his own private railway car when in this post. He had subsequent ones as General Superintendent and finally as a Vice President. In Toronto, there was a separate siding on the lakeside for the locally based CPR executives' private cars. The interior layouts of these cars were similar, but the one for the President's use was the most prestigiously appointed. The cars had 3 bedrooms, the biggest one for the manager's use. They also had a galley kitchen, a large dining room next to it, and a lounge at the end. There was a balcony platform at the end at the back. The lounge had a desk at the end, which Everett used for work, and an armchair and 2 sofas. The car was usually attached to freight trains and pulled to wherever the CPR executive had business to attend to. Its main function was for meeting and entertaining business customers of the railway. The private cars were staffed with a secretary and cook. The secretary would set up the meetings with company owners or managers in the towns and cities, and the executive would be taken there in the private car. Many reasonably sized companies had their own railway sidings for deliveries and shipments. The meetings would normally take place during lunchtime, but occasionally for dinner. The cook would prepare and serve rather elegant 3 to 4 course meals on white linen tablecloths set with fine china and silver-plated cutlery. Those were the days when finer dining was unlikely to be available in many of these locations. So it was an impressive occasion for these CPR customers. The private car was also used when required for on-site management of recoveries at train derailments and accidents. Everett's son Jack recalled a time following a rail collision when Everett worked for 3 days and nights straight. While in Montreal, Everett played a major role in the construction of the St. Luc Freight Terminal, which opened in July of 1950. This state-of-the-art push-button terminal with electrical braking cost $12 million. It was the first of its kind in Canada and replaced 3 other nearby Canadian Pacific yards, which had played important roles in Canada's war effort. The terminal was laid out in receiving, classification, and departure track sections, comprising 75 miles of new trackage on 682 acres of land. It could handle about 3,000 cars in 24 hours and was equipped with a 37-stall engine house with machine shop, a diesel engine service shop, car waiting, inspection, and repair facilities, also accommodation for train crews. The receiving yard had 15 tracks and a capacity of 1,151 cars, and the classification yard had 40 tracks and a capacity of 1,550 cars. Before reaching the hump, there was an inspection pit built of reinforced concrete under the track, with shatterproof plate glass on top of which 3 men could inspect the underside of each car. Cars requiring repairs or maintenance were diverted to the repair yard. The scale on the hump would weigh cars while they were in motion. Cars were uncoupled before the crest of the hump and routed to a destination track by the pushing of a button on the switch panel in the hump office. They then traveled down the hump by gravity without further human intervention. The retarder mechanism on the tracks after the crest of the hump was activated by the weight of the car and how far it must travel to its destination in the classification yard. During his tenure as superintendent of Montreal terminals, it was confusing that some of the staff worked in French and others in English. So he made it a rule that everyone must work in English. But when he was transferred to Calgary, the staff gave him a special bon voyage by delivering their farewell to Everett in French. Upon arrival in Calgary, he was made general superintendent for the Alberta division. As one who was not afraid of a practical joke, he enlisted someone from the local First Nations to write his thank you for the French farewell in their native language. On top of his regular duties in Calgary, Everett chaired dinners of the Old Time Rangemen's Association and was director at the annual Calgary Stampede. He became a close friend of rancher Harry Hayes, later Mayor of Calgary, and then Minister of Agriculture in Lester Pearson's government, and would join Harry and other guests at his ranch for his famous pre-stampede pancake breakfasts, washed down with his syllabub, made with milk fresh from the cow, to which generous quantities of alcohol were added. Also while here, Everett was assigned CPR's business car Alberta, renamed Business Car 9 in the 1960s. It has been restored and features an expanded lounge with comfortable sofas and tables, a large dining meeting room designed to seat 12 to 14 with a buffet china cabinet. In 1951, personal tragedy struck when his spouse Eva died suddenly. Everett, aged 50, accompanied the coffin in his private rail car, first to Saskatchewan to pick up his son Jack, and then to Toronto. Everett's automobile was in a separate freight car. News of Eva's death had preceded the train's journey, and local CPR staff greeted the train at each of its stops to pay their respects. Everett later commissioned a stained glass window for Eva's family church, St. Timothy's in Agincourt. Immediately following her mother's death, daughter Gwyn quit her job to be with her father and stayed on looking after him and his different homes for the next 6 years until her own marriage in 1957. In the early 1950s, Everett and Gwyn visited Tokyo, Japan, traveling by CPR, and Everett traveled to Rio de Janeiro in 1955 at the invitation of the local rail industry to give them advice. Soon after this, the several separate private railways there united into a single network. Everett went on to become regional manager of CPR's Eastern Region, based in Toronto, and then Prairie Region, based in Winnipeg. This was the decade when the older coal-fired steam locomotives were being replaced with newer diesel ones, and the CPR began its piggybacking service of carrying truck trailers on flatbed cars. In 1956, while in Winnipeg, Everett was promoted Vice President, Prairie Region. His duties included being Director of Canadian Pacific Transport and of Dench of Canada, a trucking firm associated with CPR, also Chairman of Northern Alberta Railways and Director of Public Markets Limited. He also assumed CPR's role as Chairman of the non-profit educational Prairie Provinces Forestry Association. Winnipeg's CPR marshalling yard was one of Canada's largest. During this time, Everett lived in a large CPR company house in Winnipeg's Tuxedo district, where he hosted annual company Christmas parties for the city mayor and other prominent locals. He was also in charge of much of the rail part of the Queen's 1959 Royal Tour of Canada. Everett met his second wife, Swea, while in Winnipeg, and they married there in 1960. In 1962, Everett was transferred and promoted once more to his final posting with the CPR as Vice President and General Manager of the Eastern Region, based back in Toronto. During this time, he was a member of the Rotary Club, the Board of Trade, and the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, and was honored with the Order of St. John by Governor-General George Vanier. While based in Toronto, Everett was responsible for a staff of about 5,000. His duties included being Vice President and Director of the Lake Erie, Northern, and Grand River Railways. His office, room 354 in Union Station, overlooked the city. In this office, he had a large closet in which he kept a made-up camp bed in case he had to work late in emergencies. Everett was pensioned early in 1963 for health reasons, including the period he had been laid off during the Depression. Everett's career with the CPR spanned just over 45 years. He retired to Winnipeg, spending summers at a cottage in Kenora, where Swea's family were based. And part of most winters in Lahaina, Hawaii. He continued to travel extensively, including by rail in North America and Europe, until his death in 1975. Everett was interred at Park Lawn Cemetery in Toronto with his first wife, Eva. Everett's second wife, Swea, outlived him by just over 40 years. She passed away peacefully in a nursing home near her family in Kenora in 2016 at the age of 105. From sweeping the platform in Sulphide to leading and growing the greatest railway in Canada, George Everett Mayne was a mentor and visionary to his beloved CPR and was a true railwayman to the end.
You had forgotten just how important the company's history had been. Your company would not have prospered and reached that exalted position it now holds, command the right to that title, the world's most complete transportation system.